thank you all again for joining us. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga. I'm a Senior Associate with Scott Legal PC in New York City. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most popular visa options for our clients, the TN visa. And we'll be talking about why it's so popular. It's really, if you have a passport from Canada or Mexico and are looking to come to the U.S. to work for an employer in the U.S., then it really is one of the fastest and most streamlined and simple visa options that's available. So we'll talk a little bit more about that during today's presentation. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least a webinar a week, and those webinars do span the spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So they cover business immigration, temporary business visas like what we're talking about today, as well as permanent employment options like the National Interest Waiver or the EB-1, investment options like the EB-5 green card, as well as other temporary visa options like the E-2, the E-1, visas like that. Our firm does handle the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law, whether that's family-based immigration, employment-based, investment-based immigration, and even visas like student visas or tourist visas. We really do everything that is related to U.S. immigration, including litigation, so if that becomes relevant to you. The takeaway is, if you have any issues, any questions regarding U.S. immigration law, we do hope that you'll reach out to us. After this presentation, you will get an email from us that includes the PowerPoint presentation you see on your screen, as well as a comprehensive guide on the TN visa that we prepared based on the best information that we have, what we see in our practice. You'll also find a link where you can sign up for future webinars, as well as a link to our YouTube channel. We do record the full-length webinars, and we post those to our YouTube channel. We also post shorter videos on various immigration-related topics to our YouTube channel, so we hope you find those helpful. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and again, will be up on our YouTube channel afterward. During this presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in using either the chat function or the question and answer function on Zoom. I will be monitoring both. We'll probably save questions for the end, but feel free to send those in whenever. I'll just respond to those at the end. And if you have questions about your specific circumstances, we do recommend that you schedule a consultation so we can get into that. We usually don't talk about specific circumstances during webinars just because of the privacy issues and time constraints, but do schedule a consultation. We'd be happy to talk with you about that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the TN visa. So the important thing to know about the TN visa is that it was created through NAFTA, through a treaty or treaties basically between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So this is a visa that is intended to make it easier for people from Canada or Mexico to work in the United States. And as I briefly mentioned before, it really is a wonderful option. If you have a job offer in the U.S. and you have a passport from Canada or Mexico, the TN visa is probably going to be the first option that we would look at for you. So the requirements. You do need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico, so you need to have a passport. You don't need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. So if you were born in India and you naturalized in Canada and have a Canadian passport, that's all you need to meet this requirement. Next is that you need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of a number of professions. So fortunately, there are dozens of eligible professions. So there are many professions. If you're at your computer, I do recommend that you quickly Google TN NAFTA regulations. We're going to be referring to this throughout the presentation, which is why it's a good idea if you're at your computer to pull the regulations up. So if you search TN NAFTA regulations, I like using the Cornell regulations. Um, and you see it's section 8 CFR section 214.6. Usually I don't recommend pulling up the regulations because they can be very complex, but the TN regulations are actually very clear. And one of the things they do is they list each of the eligible professions. So the first is accountant. Next is architect. You go down the list, you have economists, engineers, you have veterinarians, dentists. There really are, literally, there are dozens of professions listed. Now, you do need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of these professions. So even though there are dozens listed, there are some that are not included. So for example, if you're coming to the U.S. or you want to come to the U.S. to work as a marketer or in marketing, that can be a tricky one. Marketer is not one of the listed professions, and that is something we've run into before with people working in that industry. But there are others, and we'll talk about a few more examples later in this presentation. Next, you need to have the required qualifications to practice that profession. So when I say you need to have the required qualifications, I am not talking about what the U.S. employer wants you to have. So the U.S. employer might say, we want an economist with 10 years of experience. That's not the qualification that you need for the visa. For the visa, you need the qualification that's listed in the regulations. So since I mentioned economist, let's look at that. In the regulations, it says an economist needs a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. That is it. So to qualify as a TN, for a TN visa as an economist, you just need that degree. So even if the U.S. employer wants a decade of experience, for the purposes of the TN visa, all you need is a degree. The flip side of that is that if you don't have a degree, you cannot qualify as a TN economist. Another important thing to know about this is that each profession has its own requirements. So for an accountant, since it's the first on the list, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license, a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So an accountant can qualify based on a professional license. An economist cannot. An economist needs that diploma. Let's take one more example, management consultant. We will talk more about management consultants later. A management consultant can qualify based on a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience. And that is going to be either 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So management consultants, they are one of the few categories that can qualify based on experience alone. Almost no other profession in the TN regulations allows you to do that, and we'll talk about that more later. So, getting back to our requirements, need to have citizenship in Canada or Mexico, need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of the listed professions, and you need to qualify for that profession. Qualify based on the regulations, what the regulations define as qualifying. Next, you actually need to have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the U.S. So you need to have a job offer. The TN visa is not a visa that can be used to come to the U.S. to look for a job. If you want to do that, the B1 visa is going to be more suitable. But for the TN, you actually do need to have a job offer with a U.S. employer. So the U.S. employer, that is broadly defined. So a U.S. employer can be a corporation, can be an LLC, can be a sole proprietorship. It can be just a person who is performing the work and has a sole proprietorship. But there does need to be a U.S. employer that has given you a job offer. Now, for a defined length of time, the TN visa is typically issued for a maximum of 3 years. For nationals of Mexico, you do have the option of a 4-year visa. So that tends to be the maximum period of time that we would recommend that the application represent you want to work for. So in other words, the application will say we want this person to work for a period of 3 years. You can renew the TN visa indefinitely as long as you and the U.S. employer remain eligible. So just because the application says that the period of employment is intended to be 3 years does not mean you can't renew it. You certainly can renew a TN visa for another 3 years and another 3 years indefinitely as long as you remain eligible. Next, in the job that you're coming to the U.S. to perform, you need to be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with that profession. This is really important, and it might sound logical, but this does sometimes become an issue for certain applicants, and here's why. What this means is that if you're coming to the U.S., say, as an economist, you actually need to be working as an economist in the U.S. So how do you know what an economist does, or more importantly, how do you know what the U.S. government thinks that an economist does? The answer to that question is a website called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If you're at your computer, I also recommend you pull this up just because the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH for short, is such an important resource when you're applying for a TN visa. So let's go ahead and search OOH Economist. And you should see a link to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's the agency that runs the OOH. Click on Economist. And at the top of the screen, you see a tab that says what they do. So when you click that tab, you actually see a list of duties or job duties. And it says economists typically do the following. They research economic issues, they conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistical tools, etc., interpret and forecast trends, advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, etc. The point here is that the OOH, the Occupational Outlook Handbook, is the government's representation of what the government thinks specific jobs do, specific professions do. So if you're coming to the U.S. as an economist on a TN, you need to make sure that the job duties that you're going to be doing at the U.S. employer, for the U.S. employer, are consistent with the job duties on the OOH for economists. And the same is true if you're coming as an accountant, as a dentist, as a management consultant. Do make sure that you look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook and that your job duties in the U.S. are consistent with what the OOH says they should be. Now, you don't need to copy and paste the OOH job duties. That's not a good idea either. You just need to make sure that the job duties are aligned, are consistent with what the OOH says. And next, your degree. This is specific to if you're qualifying based on your degree. So if you're coming to the U.S. as an economist, you must use a degree to qualify. A management consultant might not use their degree because they can qualify based on experience alone. But if you're qualifying based on a degree, a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, then the degree must be related to the profession. So, as an example, if you are coming to the U.S. as an economist, since we've been using that example, ideally you would have a bachelor's degree or a licenciatura degree in economics. That would be very clear. You're coming to work as an economist, you have an economics degree. However, what if you have a degree in math? Probably fine. Finance, probably fine. But at that point, you do want to start, we would probably recommend including a copy of your transcript and highlights and really focusing on, and the application should emphasize, any courses you've taken that were related to economics. So even if your degree is in math or in finance, emphasizing the coursework you completed as part of your degree that was related to economics. What if your degree is in French, completely unrelated to economics? That is going to be a really difficult application to get approved if you're, to continue our example, if you're applying as an economist. If your degree is completely unrelated to the profession, then that is a challenge. But what we would recommend doing, if really you don't have the option and you have this great job opportunity, say as an economist, but your degree is in French, What we would do is first look at the transcript. Did you take any classes in economics or related to the profession? Did you write a thesis related to economics? Did you do independent research related to economics? Could you get a letter from a dean or someone at your university talking about how even though your degree is in French, you completed coursework and got preparation that equipped you to practice, to work as an economist? It's things like that that we would include in the application to really make your case that your degree did qualify you for the profession. Again, it's an uphill battle. It's not guaranteed. It's not a slam dunk. But if we had someone come to us that said, look, my degree's in French, I have a job opportunity as an economist, I want to give this a shot, that is how we would do it. The other thing that's useful to know is that the Occupational Outlook Handbook can actually have helpful information on this. So before we were using the tab at the top of the screen called What They Do, but there's another tab, How to Become One. So if we click that tab, you'll see under the Education headline, so there is helpful language here that says, to pursue an advanced degree in economics, program applicants may need to have completed undergraduate coursework in subjects such as economics or mathematics. So if you have a degree in math, that's helpful language. Candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. That's great language. If you have a related degree, say in statistics or mathematics, then that's the kind of language you want to include in your application to argue that even though your degree is not in economics, you have a related degree that even the government itself says is adequate for you to enter the field and work as an economist. So anyway, the takeaway here is ideally you have a degree that matches the profession, but if you don't, there are arguments that can be made in a lot of circumstances can be made to argue that you still qualify. So this is just a screenshot of the Occupational Outlook Handbook that I've been referring to. Over here you see the What They Do tab. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but over here you see the How to Become One. So What They Do has the job duties. How to Become One talks about the related degrees that you might qualify for a position with. So let's slightly shift gears and talk about what is probably the most common question, or one of the most common questions we get regarding the TN visa. And that is, does it require sponsorship? Does a U.S. employer need to sponsor me for a TN visa? And the short answer is no. And I'll explain why. So first, let's define what sponsorship is. In the context of U.S. immigration law, sponsorship is basically when a U.S. employer takes additional steps to test the U.S. labor market to see if there's a U.S. worker who's able and willing to do the job, providing a prevailing wage to the employee, which is usually higher than the minimum wage, doing things like ensuring that the worker is not benched, meaning they have active work the entire time they are here in the U.S. If the job is terminated, sometimes sponsorship can require the employer to pay for their travel back home. So as you can tell, in U.S. immigration, sponsorship brings with it a lot of additional requirements. The TN visa does not require any of those requirements. So the TN visa does not require that the U.S. employer tests the labor market. It does not require that the U.S. Employer advertise the job. Doesn't require that the U.S. employer first offer the job to U.S. Eligible U.S. workers. Does not require that the U.S. employer pay above the minimum wage. So really, there are no requirements associated with sponsorship that come with the TN visa. So what does the employer need to do? Basically, the U.S. employer needs to do what they would do for any other employee. They need to make an honest and legitimate job offer, provide that to the foreign prospective worker, the TN applicant, and they need to provide a letter that says that they do intend to employ that worker in the U.S., the wage or salary that they intend to pay the worker, the period of time that they intend to employ the worker, the job duties that the employee will perform. The letter will talk about who the employer is, but it really is just a letter that describes who the employer is, who the employee is, how the employee qualifies, and what the employer intends to pay them and for how long. This is not a binding contract. The employee, in most circumstances, will still be at will, meaning that the employee can be fired if it doesn't work out. Conversely, the employee can quit. They're not required to keep working for the employer. If the employment terminates, then of course the employee would need to leave the U.S. But this is really, these requirements in general are not different from what the employer would have to do for any other employee, whether they are a U.S. citizen, a green card holder, or a TN visa applicant. The employer would need to make a bona fide, legitimate offer and basically express what they intend to pay the worker, an at-will employee or a contractor. So that is important to understand, and we do have conversations with employers that don't understand this and really want to talk through the requirements that are on them and how minimal those requirements are. The one thing I will say, this is a very slight technical caveat, but it is one I want to share, which is that if the employee, if the TN applicant is applying at a consulate or a port of entry, so an airport or a land crossing, that application is submitted by the employee, by the prospective worker. And so if the application is denied, it is the worker's application that is denied. If the application is submitted within the U.S. to USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, then it is the U.S. employer that is submitting the application. This does not create additional requirements on the employer other than signing the application form. It's called an I-129 form. And it is actually the U.S. employer that would sign that form. But that being said, no additional requirements apply. Everything I said before is still true. There is still no prevailing wage. There is no requirement to test the labor market, etc. It's just that technical aspect where it's the U.S. employer applying if the application is submitted to USCIS. Now, there are certain differences in the application process for Canadians and Mexicans. So let's talk about those. The biggest difference is that nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry. What that means is nationals of Canada can have their TN application, they would print it out, and they would have originals of certain documents like their diploma, and they can apply when they arrive at the airport or at the land crossing if they're entering the U.S. by land. They would present their application to the Customs and Border Protection, the CBP officer, and at that point would get an immediate decision on their TN application. Extremely convenient, very fast decision. It's immediate, fairly inexpensive. So this is the preferred method of applying for most Canadian nationals. Nationals of Mexico must apply either at a consulate if they're outside the U.S., or if they're inside the U.S., they have the option of applying either at a consulate abroad or at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Canadians can apply at a consulate or at USCIS if they're inside the U.S., but because of the inexpensive, how inexpensive it is and how fast and easy it is to apply at a port of entry, that is usually what a Canadian will opt for. If they, for example, had a spouse or a child who's not a national of Canada, then the Canadian national, their spouse or child would need to apply at a consulate. So only nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry. So if the spouse or child is required to apply at a consulate, then the principal applicant would usually join them. That's one of the few occasions when a Canadian would opt to apply for a visa at the consulate. But otherwise, the port of entry really does tend to be the preferred option. Nationals of Canada, when they enter the U.S., they are generally granted TN status for 3 years. So what that means is they can stay in the U.S. for 3 years, work for the TN employer for 3 years. And then to renew the TN, they would basically leave the U.S. and come back in with a new TN application and be granted another 3-year period. That can be shortened. For example, if for management consultants, that's a good example where, and we'll talk more about that, where it is sometimes strategic to apply for fewer than 3 years, in which case you would be granted for the TN status for fewer than 3 years. Nationals of Mexico have the benefit of being able to receive a TN visa for 4 years. And we do generally recommend that. It does cost an additional fee, but it saves you needing to go to the consulate more often. Even for nationals of Mexico, though, each time you enter the U.S., you are admitted for 3 years and would need to leave once that 3-year period is up, or apply to extend that period from within the U.S. through USCIS. Now, in certain cases for nationals of Mexico, renewals of their TN visa can be done through the mail. So they would submit their application to the consulate, and the consulate would, again, these are renewal applications. The consulate would review that application, and if the applicant is eligible to renew by mail, the consulate would let them know. One thing to know about this, though, is that you do need to be in the jurisdiction. So you do need to be in Mexico if you are mailing in your passport and requesting a visa renewal. So you cannot do that from the U.S. We're going to switch gears again and talk about 2 uniquely challenging TN visa categories, TN professions. These 2 categories are management consultants and economists, and they're challenging for completely different reasons. But these really are 2 of the most difficult TN professions to apply for. So let's talk about management consultants first. The reason that this category is difficult is that management consultants, this is one of the few professions where you do not need a degree in order to apply for the profession. Almost every other TN profession, you need either a degree, a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or you need a professional license, which in and of itself would usually require a degree. So if you do not have a degree, then this is going to be one of the very few categories that you're eligible for. What this oftentimes means is that people who really are not a good fit for the management consulting category, they're not going to be performing the job duties of a management consultant, they will still apply in this category because it's the only one they qualify for. The government knows this, and they scrutinize these applications very closely. So what does that mean if you're applying for this category? What it means is that you need to, let me take a step back. One important thing to know about this category is that not all management consultant applications are equally challenging. If you're coming to the U.S. to work for a management consulting firm, so something like Oliver Wyman, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, that is not a risky application because you are clearly coming to work as a management consultant, as an employee of a management consulting firm. That is not a risky application. What is a risky management consulting application is if you're coming to the U.S. to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. The example I like to use is, let's say that you are an expert in solar panels, designing solar panels. And you are a national of Mexico. You've been doing this for a decade, designing solar panels, making them more efficient. And a company in the US that designs solar panels wants to hire you so that you can help them improve their solar panel design. That is a great example of a relatively risky TN management consulting application because the US employer is a solar panel company. They're not a management consulting company. So then let's get back to what I was talking about before. How do you structure that application so that it addresses some of the risks? The most important thing to keep in mind is that the application needs to make it clear that you really are coming to the US to work as a management consultant. So let's take our solar panel example. That application needs to make very clear that this national of Mexico is going to be coming to the US to consult for the US company to address a very specific challenge that has been clearly defined in the application. The application should make it clear what that challenge is that the US company is facing. Should make it very clear why the applicant is the ideal person to come to the US and work as a consultant, consult for the US company and help them address that challenge. The the application should make clear how that consultant's going to be paid. Typically, a consultant is not going to be hired as a full-time W-2 employee at the US company, which makes sense. When McKinsey is hired to consult, their consultants are typically not going to become a W-2 employee of the client company that they're consulting for. Similarly, here, our national of Mexico should not become a W-2 employee of the US company if he really is just consulting for them, providing consulting services to them. Similarly, there should be a consulting agreement that defines what that consultant is going to provide to the U.S. company, what the deliverables are going to be, how he's going to be, what his timeline is on delivering those things in months 1 through 3. Maybe he's going to observe the design process in months 4 through 6, going to provide recommendations and an assessment, and in months 7 through 9, provide recommendations to management. Months 10 through 12, actually observe the implementation. Things like that should be in the management agreement, the consulting agreement, as well as details on how the consultant's going to be paid based on those. So again, what we're doing here is we're thinking, what does a management consulting agreement and engagement really look like in everyday consulting agreements and consulting arrangements? And how can the TN application reflect that? And that really is what the government's looking for. They're going to want to see that this really is a legitimate consulting arrangement. Of course, everything I've said needs to be legitimate. This person really should not be a W-2 employee. They really should be providing these deliverables on the time frame that's represented. So these are not things you do just to get an approval and then you get into the US and you change your plans. That could lead to misrepresentation and fraud allegations by the government. So you really don't want to do that. But it is important, what oftentimes we will do is we will be in touch with the U.S. employer as well as the employee, the TN applicant, talking through what actually needs to happen in the U.S., how the role can be changed and actually changed so that when they come to the U.S. they're actually doing things that are in line with the TN requirements, and that really is going to improve your chances of getting an approval. Economists. This is a challenging category again for a completely different reason from management consultants. Economists, this category is challenging because in 2017 the government issued a policy memo that said that people coming to the U.S. as economists on TN visas need to be working as economists and not as financial analysts or market research analysts. Okay, so what does this mean for you? What it means is that the Occupational Outlook Handbook is especially important. If you are coming to the U.S. as an economist, then you need to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook and make sure that your job duties are aligned with what the government says an economist should do. At the same time, you need to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook website for financial analysts and market research analysts. Look at those job duties and make sure you're not doing those job duties, or that those job duties are not taking a majority of your time. Because if they are taking a majority of your time, the government is going to say you're actually coming to the U.S. to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, and as a result, we're going to deny the application. If you're applying as an economist, your job duties need to be aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook's website listing the job duties of an economist. One related point that I've made implicit is that the job title does not matter. What matters is your actual job duties. So even if you're coming to the U.S. you have an offer, they want you to work as a financial analyst, they're aware that that is a category that faces scrutiny. So they say, well, let's just change your job title to economist. That's not going to help you. What matters is the actual job duties. So you need to work with your employer, or if you decide to work with us, we will work with the employer to talk through what job duties are acceptable for economists. So again, you actually do need to be doing the job duties that are represented in the application. It's not a matter of just changing them. Now, if you do get an offer to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, what do you do if the TN is not a good fit? Two options. One thing we would consider is a management consultant role appropriate? It might be, particularly for market research analysts. If you are an expert in, say, marketing, and a U.S. employer wants to hire you to help them with a specific, marketing issue they're facing, that could be a management consulting role, a very legitimate management consulting role. Again, where you're coming in to address a specific challenge, there's a consulting agreement, you're not a full-time employee taking a permanent role at the company. That could work very well. The other option, though, is to just look for a different visa. So an O1 might be an option if you're an expert in the field. Potentially an L visa if you've been working for the employer abroad. So we would look at different visa options in that case. All right, let's get into a few more details on the application process. I said before that only nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry, and again, that's a land crossing or an airport. Regardless of where you are applying, the TN application generally looks the same and consists of the same documents. So it is the most important document, generally speaking, in a TN application is going to be a job offer letter. That is not just a typical job offer. What it is a letter from the U.S. employer where they describe who they are as an employer, what they sell, how long they've been in business, number of employees they have. They talk about who the applicant is and how the applicant qualifies for the TN visa, again, specific to the profession. So if this is for an economist, they talk about how this person has a degree in economics, for example. They can also talk at that point about why this person is a great fit for the company. So it might be that in addition to the degree, or the basis that they're qualifying for the TN, they have experience that's valuable to the U.S. employer. So talk about the U.S. employer, talk about the applicant. Next, talk about what the role in the U.S. looks like, what the job duties will be that the TN worker will perform. The letter will also talk about the expected salary or wage. That wage should be consistent with what someone usually makes in the role. So you don't want to, for example, say, I'm hiring an economist and I'm paying them $7 an hour or $8 an hour, which is minimum wage. The reason is that the officer is going to say that's not very much for an economist, and therefore I'm thinking, I as the officer am thinking this person's actually not going to be working as an economist. The flip side is sometimes paying them too much could raise questions. Where this can be relevant is, let's say that someone is coming in as an economist and is going to be paid, say, $500,000 a year. That could be a legitimate economist role, but the question that could come out of that is this person actually working, say, as a chief financial officer or a CEO, chief executive officer? And what ends up happening, if that's the case, is the person becomes less an economist, performing the job duties of an economist, and more an executive, a chief financial officer or a chief executive officer. And if that happens, then they could be disqualified from a TN because become ineligible for a TN because they are not performing the job duties of an economist. I have seen this happen. You can have someone who starts off, to continue with our example, as a TN economist, and they just get promoted, and they're on their third TN visa with the employer, and they've become a chief financial officer. And their job duties are no longer really what they were doing 9 years before as an economist, but more what a CEO or a CFO does, and that can result in a denial. So do be careful of that. Again, if that is your situation, we would consider other visa options, whether that's the O1, the H1B, something, even the L could be a good option there. So anyway, that is something to be mindful of. So that's the job offer letter. I went on a tangent there about the job offer letter, but in addition to the job offer letter, you do in the application want to include proof of how you qualify. If you're qualifying based on a degree, you need to have your original degree. Bring your original degree to the port of entry or to the consulate. If you're qualifying based on experience, say as a consultant, you need original signed letters from your past employers talking about how you do meet those requirements, those 5 years of experience or whatever the experience requirement is that you're satisfying. If you are qualifying based on a professional license, bring that license. One note, if you're applying at a port of entry or the consulate, they do want original documents. So wherever possible, bring original documents. Bring a certified copy of your transcript. Bring your original diploma or a certified copy of it. Do not bring copies. The ports of entry and consulates encounter a lot of fraud, so they do want to see originals. USCIS, on the other hand, if you're inside the U.S. applying through USCIS, only accepts. They will accept originals, but they prefer copies. If you send an original, what they'll tell you is don't expect it back. They probably will not give it back. So we generally will only submit copies to USCIS. So just to take a step back, what's in the application? Job offer letter from the U.S. employer, proof of how you qualify, whether that's diploma, degrees, transcript, experience letters, or professional license. Obviously, you need your passport, and that's really the packet. So that is going to be the same packet whether you're applying at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS, with certain minor differences. If you're applying at a consulate, you would start that process by submitting a DS-160. It's an online form that goes to the consulate. They will then schedule your biometrics and your interview. You'll show up at your interview and you'll bring exactly what I just described: an original signed employment letter, proof of how you qualify, passport. If you're applying through USCIS, you'll provide copies of all of that documentation as well as a Form I-129. And that Form I-129, as I mentioned before, is signed by the employer. Applying through USCIS, one of the things you can do is apply with premium processing, which guarantees a decision within 15 business days. That is a fast turnaround. If you don't use that, you are looking at months before you get a decision. So if you are in the U.S., you don't want to leave the U.S., you do have the option of applying through USCIS with premium processing and getting a decision within 15 business days. Okay, that covers everything on this slide. I do want to quickly clarify so that there's not confusion, just reiterating what we talked about before, that only Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico must apply either at a consulate, if they're outside the U.S., or at USCIS if they're inside the US. They can apply at a consulate if they're inside the US. They just have to leave. But USCIS is only an option for if they're inside the US. Nationals of Canada can also apply to USCIS, a consulate, or a port of entry. Mexicans just cannot apply at a port of entry. Okay. Some tips and common pitfalls. And this is our last slide. So I know one question has come in. Feel free to send in any other questions if you haven't already. So common tips and pitfalls. We do recommend that you call ahead to the port of entry before you show up, especially if you're unfamiliar with the procedures. During COVID, during the pandemic, ports of entry would change their procedures, and so it became more common to call them. It still is a good idea, just so you know exactly what the requirements are when they're accepting applications, whether there's a certain entry you need to use, whatever it is. It's good to call ahead of time. Certain ports of entry are also optimized for first-time applicants, so you can find out on. We're happy to help with that if you do decide to go forward with us. If not, the CBP website does share that information, which ports of entry are optimized for first-time TN applicants. So it can be a good idea to use those ports of entry if you're a first-time applicant. Next, make sure that the employer, the person, the specific person at the U.S. employer who signed the employer letter in your application, make sure that they are available for a call at the time you're applying at the port of entry or at the consulate. The reason is that sometimes the government official will call them at the time of the interview just to make sure the job offer and the job is legitimate. It's usually not a long conversation, but it's good to have them prepared just in case the officer calls. It doesn't happen often, but if it does, it's good to give them a heads up. And again, that letter should have the employer's original signature and should be printed on the employer's official letterhead with their contact information on it. If the application's at a port of entry or a consulate. USCIS, a copy is okay. Next, the TN visa is a non-immigrant. It's a temporary visa. And what that means is that you should be prepared to show your ties to your home country. This usually doesn't come up unless you're renewing the TN visa a second, third, or fourth time. If it's your first or second time on a TN visa, they are probably not going to want to see ties to your home country, whether that's Canada or Mexico. But it doesn't hurt to have those documents with you. So this can be documentation showing that you own property abroad, or you have a bank account abroad, or you have family abroad, whatever it is. It can be a good idea to just have that documentation with you, just in case you're asked. But again, it usually doesn't come up the first or even the second time you're applying for a TN. Okay, so we've received a few questions. Feel free to send in others as they occur to you. So, can you have multiple TN? In other words, multiple employers? Excellent question. The answer is you can. You can have concurrent TN status. And the way you would do that is there are multiple ways, but you basically would use the same procedure to apply that we've already talked about, whether that's at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS. You would just have documentation for both of those positions, and you would make it clear in your application that you're applying for concurrent TN status, and they would basically make it clear in your passport that you have authorization to work for two different TN employers. Again, you do need an application for each of those, so each one needs to qualify. One thing to be careful of is you can only work on it in TN status after receiving approval. So if you're already in the US on a TN visa, let's say you're working as an economist for company A as a TN visa holder, and you get an offer from company B that says, hey, we want you to work part-time for us as well, and company A is okay with that. Don't start working for company B until you've applied for concurrent TN status for both employers. Once you have that approval, you can work for both. So that is a great question. The logistics should line up. So, if you're saying, I'm working 80 hours a week for company A, it's going to be hard to convince the government that you're going to work 40 hours a week for company B. So, do make it clear that the logistics do matter, that, both you're able to work for both, that the hours for both are going to line up, and that it makes sense logistically. Can someone have a TN and another visa, such as E1 or O1? So the answer is you can have multiple valid visas. So a lot of people will have a 10-year B1, B2 visa and a TN. The important thing to know, for an E1 or an O1, it would be very odd to have both of those. I'm struggling to think of a situation where you would have a valid TN and a valid E1, or a valid TN and a valid O1. And the reason is that whenever you enter the US, you need to clearly define what you're doing on that visit. And if you have a TN visa, it's because you have an active job. You're actively employed by a U.S. employer. So it would be odd to both have active employment at a U.S. employer while also working on an E1 as a treaty trader. You're coming in sometimes to do this job, you're coming in other times to do that. You cannot do both on a single visit because you need to elect which status you have in the U.S. So the technical legal answer is that you can have two valid visas. The practical answer is that I do not know of a situation where you would have two valid visas and you'd be using both to come into the US. You have to elect one on each visit. And if you have a company in the US that's active and you're actively involved in it, you need to be really careful coming in on a visa that does not authorize you to work on that company, because let's take an example. If you have, say, a TN visa and a B1, B2. B1, B2 visa does not allow you to work in the US. A TN visa allows you to work for one employer, or the TN employer, unless you have a concurrent TN. So if you have a valid TN to work for an employer, but you come in on a B2 visa, which does not allow you to work, one thing the government can do is accuse you of unauthorized work, because you're coming into the U.S. as a visitor without work authorization, but you've represented that you have active employment at this company. So either you're not working for the TN employer or you're working without authorization. So my general recommendation is if you have a visa that allows you to work in the U.S., you should probably be using that visa to enter the U.S., especially if it's an E1 or an E2 visa where you're self-employed. Okay. What is the best way to apply for a green card if you have TN status? Another great question. It is possible to apply for a green card while you're on a TN, but it is not easy. And the reason is because of what is called dual intent. If a TN visa requires non-immigrant intent, that means you intend to leave at the end of your TN visa. A green card is exactly the opposite of that. That is the intent to permanently stay in the U.S. So how can you have a TN visa and apply for a green card at the same time? The answer is, what is prohibited is using a temporary visa to enter the U.S. and then to apply for a green card. So if you entered on a TN visa and you did not intend to apply for a green card, and you change your mind down the road, that is okay. It's okay to change your mind as long as it was not your intention to apply for a green card when you entered on the TN. So how do you do it? Well, hopefully you would have TN status for a couple years. You would file, first of all, we should talk about this over a consultation because it is a high-risk area. It's hard to navigate. But in general, what you would do is you would maintain your TN, continue working for that employer, and ideally you would file an immigrant visa application with consular processing. um, showing the government you intend to apply at a consulate so that you can continue to leave and come in on a TN, because again, you're not intending to apply for the green card within the US. You actually have to leave to get the green card at a consulate if you're consular processing. And you'd maintain your underlying TN status while keeping that green card application going, again, at the consulate. You can adjust status, but again, intention cannot be to do that when you're entering on a TN. But it is possible to do it. You just need to be careful. And again, it's better discussed over a consultation because it is so complex and high risk. What type of education evaluation should we have? Okay. So an educational evaluation. This is a great question. I did not mention this, so it is important. If your degree is from, and you're qualifying based on your degree, and your degree is from Canada, Mexico, or the United States, you do not need an education equivalency certificate. What that is it's a third party, a company, that looks at your degree and says what the equivalent is in the U.S. at a U.S. educational institution. So if you went to, you do need an educational equivalency if your degree is from any school outside of Canada, Mexico, or the United States. So if you went to the London School of Economics and you got a bachelor's or a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, sounds crazy, but you do need an educational equivalency certificate because London School of Economics is not in Canada, Mexico, or the U.S. We do not recommend, we don't have any specific recommendation in terms of who does the evaluation. Find a reputable company. It's generally fine to go with a reputable company that people tend to use. Read reviews online, and that company would then provide you with the educational equivalency certificate. So the important thing, do remember, if the degree is from outside the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, you do need that certificate. Can we work remotely from Canada after working in the U.S. for some time with a TN visa? So U.S. immigration law only cares about what you're doing in the U.S. As long as you're not committing a crime. So there is nothing in U.S. immigration law that says you cannot work remotely from Canada. Your U.S. employer might care about that because of tax reasons, but from a U.S. immigration standpoint, you can certainly have a TN and then work remotely from Canada. Probably not going to affect your immigration at all because the U.S. doesn't really care about what you do abroad. They do care if you're working remotely within the U.S. and you don't have work authorization. So if you're employed by a Canadian company working remotely in the U.S., that can raise immigration issues. I am working remotely for a company in the U.S. I was looking to get a TN visa, but they are unwilling to mention temporary services as it's a permanent role. How to convince the employer and get TN support letter accordingly? Well, the way to do this is the TN application is not saying that the role is not permanent. What it is saying is that we intend to employ this person in TN status for 3 years. And again, it's perfectly fine to renew that. So you're not saying anything like, this is not a permanent role. You don't have to say that. What you have to say is we intend to employ this person in TN status for a period of 3 years, and we'll pay them $100,000 a year. That's our intention. Excuse me. And then when those 3 years are up, you would submit a new TN application that says exactly the same thing. We intend to employ this person in TN status for another 3-year period. So you're not saying anything about whether the role is permanent or not. You're only talking about how long they intend to employ you in TN status for this approval. This is just an application for TN status for a 3-year period. So that's all you're saying is your intention to employ the employer's intention to employ them for that, to employ you for that period. I have a 3 years bachelor's degree from India. Will it be okay for the TN visa? So what is important here is that education equivalency. If the equivalency is equivalent to a baccalaureate degree in the U.S., it shouldn't be a problem. However, if the equivalency says this is not equivalent to a U.S. bachelor's degree, that is going to be a problem if you're qualifying based on the degree. Feel free to schedule a consultation if you have more questions about whether a 3-year degree or a 2-year degree will qualify. There are certain certification programs that will qualify, but those tend to be in Canada. We are at time, but let's see if we can get through the last 2 questions quickly. Do we have to be on a W-2 or can we work on 1099? You can work on a 1099, and for management consultants, 1099s are more common. I was earlier on an H-1B and then I moved to Canada, got my Canadian citizenship, planning to apply for a TN visa. Will it be an issue if I was earlier on an H-1B and I have my I-140 approved? So the I-140 is what matters here, not the H-1B. I-140 is a green card application, so you are already signaling to the government your intention to remain permanently. So it's not insurmountable, especially if the I-140 has been withdrawn. But if you have an active I-140, then you need to be ready to explain how that is for consular processing. You're going to be leaving the U.S. because if you selected adjustment of status on an I-140 and from within the U.S. and you're applying for a TN, there's a very good chance you're going to face an uphill battle and have issues with that because of the dual intent issue we talked about. You will get a recording. It will be on YouTube. We'll follow up by email on that. Cannot talk about a hypothetical, unfortunately. Please feel free to schedule a consultation. Great, and we are at time, so thank you all. Do keep an eye out for our email where we will have a link to our YouTube channel. Please do check that out, and we do hope to see you on future webinars. And do schedule a consultation if you have any remaining questions or want to talk through your specific circumstances. We'd be very happy to talk through that. So thank you all. Stay well and have a great day. Thank you.